Okay, cool. So in the early sessions of the day, we've kind of gone over the destruction of the environment, and we've concretely rooted that in the capitalist process, and so kind of driven forward the need to fight capitalism. And it wasn't just a kind of doom and gloom thing. It is saying that the objective conditions for resistance are emerging, and people are becoming more aware of these unhideable facts of how the environment is destroyed. But there are lots of trends and groups out there that fight capitalism or claim to be fighting capitalism, right? And some of them acting kind of surreptitiously as false friends in the movement. And so as we endeavour to go out and play our part, our subjective part in changing the world, we need to understand why that happens. Why is there this division and fracturing across the left, as it calls itself? And understanding imperialism.
Can you not say my whole speech?
Yeah, sure, it's part of that, and that's what Annie's going to be going into now.
Okay. So the speakers today have outlined both practically, through like the examples of mining, data, etc., and theoretically, why environmental salvation is impossible under capitalism. But as Lenin asked, what is to be done? And this remains the key question. And hopefully in this final session we'll have a chance to discuss this. In one sense, the answer is simple. We know that in order to manage the Earth's resources sustainably, we need a socialist system, where the use and distribution of resources is planned democratically in order to meet human need and according to the ecological ability of the land and water systems to regenerate. What is more complicated is how we get there. And that will be the main kind of focus of this session. Now, Candice mentioned about Cuba. I'm going to reiterate some of that because, it's one thing saying, capitalism is bad, we're against capitalism, but the kind of main, what you get kind of taught through cultural products, the education system, it's like that it's inevitable. Capitalism is just the fact and that there is no alternative. And in fact, in my school, we just got made to read a book called Animal Farm, and somehow by reading about a few animals that all went wrong, that basically teaches us that socialism and the Soviet Union couldn't work, and therefore, that's not a solution. I think Cuba is like absolutely central to this climate movement and to the future because, and I'll go into more in detail later, how absent it is from a lot of discourses around climate or about the environment. Now, why Cuba is so important is for two reasons. One is that the role that they're playing internationally in the fight against imperialism. And I think we can have more discussion about that later. Not just, their medical brigades, the fact that they train doctors from poor communities around the world, like the vaccines that they've developed, not only to meet the needs of their population, but they've developed like medicines without gelatin to be able to be used in countries where people don't want to consume like pork products. They show what is possible with minimal resources when the working class is in power. In terms of the environment, then Cuba also shows that environmental sustainability is possible, and that is so crucial. In 2019, there was some research by an organization called the Sustainability Index. It ranked Cuba as the most sustainable country on the planet. Now, this sustainability it's quite flawed how it's measured because it's based a lot on GDP, which is a measure of finance, which is very like skewed to capitalism, because obviously you only earn money if you have to sell your labor. So if you live from the land, you might be really poor, but you can actually feed yourself. So when that's partly why the statistics and stuff we learn in school about how poverty is decreasing and that there's like this progress in capitalism, a lot of that is pure fiction because people have been forced into the marketplace, and so yes, they're earning money, but they've actually lost their livelihood. And yeah, but it's the most reliable measure that has been developed internationally for sustainability is to look at the Human Development Index, which is doesn't just measure wealth, but it also measures things like education and healthcare, life expectancy, infant mortality, things like that. So if you've got a high Human Development Index, that demonstrates that the population's needs or their basic needs are pretty much met. So a sustainable country doesn't just need to not have too much of an impact on the planet's resources, it also needs to meet the needs of the population. And Cuba does both. Even though it's a third world country, a country under the most brutal economic blockade that the world has ever seen, I think, for a sustained period, from 1961, Cuba's been under economic blockade. And despite that, despite the legacy of slavery, colonialism, all of the disadvantages that most of the third world face, but through systematic underdevelopment by the capitalist countries, then Cuba has managed to reach a high Human Development Index ranking. Now, when Fidel gave that speech that was quoted, it's really worth going away and reading it, and it's actually in the back of our Cuba pamphlet, because it's a brilliant speech, but when you read it, you could think that someone gave it last week, when actually Fidel Castro gave that speech about tomorrow is too late in 1991. And after that summit, where all these, it was the first time all the leaders made these commitments to the environment, but Cuba actually went away and changed stuff immediately and put into their constitution that there has to be a commitment to promote the conservation of the environment as part of the fundamental law of the country. And that has been reasserted when they redeveloped their constitution through popular participation and a massive democratic process that took months, and that continued. So in Cuba's constitution includes the commitment to promote the conservation of the environment and to fight the effects of climate change. Candice briefly alluded to Cuba's reforestation program, which is recognized by the United Nations as the most advanced in Latin America. I think it's also worth pointing out that deforestation in Cuba started at the onset of colonialism, and the trees were cut down in order to build room for sugar plantations, because obviously the soil is very fertile in forests, and that's why it's been used. And this story is mirrored in countries around the world. Even today, if you think of the palm oil plantations being in Indonesia, and we're told on our biscuits that, it's sustainable palm oil, and there's been loads of research done to show that kind of myth of sustainability, sustainable palm oil, is a contradiction in terms, because all palm oil is produced by cutting down making fertile land out of deforestation. Also, the accelerating loss of the Amazon rainforest. Apparently last year it was the first time that the area emitted more carbon than it absorbed, which is really terrifying, because it's sometimes been described as the lungs of the earth. But why Cuba is so important is it shows that it's actually possible to regenerate once that people are in power and the land is under the democratic control of the working class. And Cuba is now about 30% forest, which is, I can't remember all the statistics off the top of my head, but it's a massive increase since in comparison to the deforestation that occurred. It is briefly worth mentioning Cuba's urban farming model, because we've talked about the metabolic rift before, and by using essentially the waste from animals and the poo's put on the land essentially straight away. It's a sustainable system, and they also use worms in order to break down. You can't just put waste products directly on the earth. That's not how it works. There has to be a process of fermentation, and worms are a really effective way of breaking down the nutrients so that the soil can then absorb them again. Now, these methods were actually developed in response to a crisis brought on by the sudden loss of trade and therefore access to fertilizers and food when the Soviet Union collapsed. and so they were developed in a period of crisis. But since, like, it's sometimes, and like all sorts of accusations get leveled against Cuba, almost like, oh well, their environmental achievements were only because of X, Y, and Z. But the point is that they then developed tourism, and they've developed it in a sustainable way, and they've maintained all of the they've maintained their commitment to organic farming and developed it further. So I just think we have to be aware of that, because it's just really, you often hear Cuba and their achievements being dismissed as either, oh, but it's just a small country, or oh well, they only did that because of this, and or they're only able to be socialist because of the blockade, which is the most insulting. It's just so insulting to the Cuban people to think that actually they don't have any agency or democratic choice or voice, and it's, you know, that they're just forced to live like that, and it's not a real democracy. So we are actually going to have a documentary film released in a few months by some of our comrades who are kind of looking into it in a lot of detail, and so it will be really important for us to understand what is going on in Cuba, because it is key. But in this talk I want to move on more to, okay, so if socialism is what we need, then how do we get there? And in order to answer this question, we need to understand historically and materially where we find ourselves, because the tasks facing progressive people here in the heartlands of imperialist Britain are rooted in the context that we're living in. Like, Britain is one of the oldest capitalist countries in the world. It's a country that's grown rich and continues to grow rich off the plunder and exploitation of peoples and lands across the world. And this extreme concentration of wealth has allowed a level of distribution of wealth within Britain to make the current system fairly comfortable for a sizable section of the working class. And I use working class in the technical sense there. So people who have to sell their labour power in order to be able to survive. But, you know, the better off sections of the working class, it may be more colloquially referred to as middle class. So, you know, if you've got a professional job, then if you don't pay your mortgage, you will still end up out on the street. But you are not in the same position materially as someone who is, like, for example, an undocumented migrant cleaning the floors in the heart of the financial centre in London, who doesn't have, you do not have the same material conditions. This, like, wealth has allowed the ruling class in Britain to adopt different strategies for trying to kind of maintain its power. You might have, I'm sure everyone's heard the concept of divide and rule, which has been used around the world, but also is used here. And we've seen historically, I was reading an article, we've got a lot of archive material as well on our website, about an uprising in Bristol in 1831, where basically this was before even the Chartists had become a political force, and people were against, they wanted a reform in the Houses of Lords, and it was a massive spontaneous movement, and it resulted in, like, several prisons being stormed and the prisoners released, and then the buildings being set on fire. And in that process, though, then there were people, I've forgotten the name of the organisations, but there were certain sections that were basically trying to, like, calm things down. And then there's another article which was in the last issue of the paper, which is really worth reading, about the uprisings of black youth in 1981. So that's like hundreds of years later, and yet you see the same trend emerging of people who claim to want change but actually attack the violence of the oppressed, or, you know, they want, you know, they try and, like, appeal for calm and actually play into the hands of the ruling class. In terms of my own experience, then, like, I got involved as an independent individual in the movement against the war on Iraq, before Iraq was invaded in 2003. And I saw it happening with my own eyes, where there was a real spontaneous and like passionate determination amongst the people. I was in Newcastle at the time. We wanted to stop the war. There was such determination, the same determination that I experienced in the Black Lives Matter movement like last year, in the Palestine protests. You know, I don't think it's a question of, you know, people in Britain being stupid or not wanting, you know, not really understanding. There are a lot of people in this country that do understand. But what happened when I was involved was that, well, first of all, the organisers, the kind of official organisers of the movement, who were self-styled organisers, they decided to form the Stop the War Coalition. They decided in advance who was at the leadership of that coalition, and they decided to make sure that it was, the way they put it is, it had to be a broad base, so they couldn't talk about certain things. Like, you weren't allowed to openly support the Iraqi resistance because that might put some people off. You weren't allowed to call the Labour Party a war party because they wanted to maintain the involvement of Labour MPs. And I saw, like myself as an individual, how impossible it was to change things as an individual, because like on one occasion we were blocking this major road, we were causing actual disruption that would have been necessary to stop the war, and it was peaceful, but we were causing actual disruption. And then the police got a professor at the university who was involved in Make Poverty History to, or maybe he was later involved in that, but you know, he was a left-leaning kind of professor, to make an announcement on the police megaphone that, oh, he's not, you know, he's not telling people what to do, but the police have said they're going to start arresting leaders soon. And so he was kind of, and it totally dissipated the mood. It was from total defiance, and then by playing that role, you know, within 10 minutes it had packed up and gone home. And I couldn't help but noticing at the time that it just seemed like these protests down in London every 6 months were kind of like a day out for quite privileged people. And I don't even mean just people that could afford the bus fare, but, you know, I mean people that weren't working a night shift in the local takeaway later, or who didn't have caring responsibilities, or, you know, whether it be children or elderly family members they had to look after. And since then, my understanding has evolved to know that actually that was deliberate. It was in order to control it and make it containable. And so, because they didn't, the people leading that movement were not interested in real change. So, skip forward to 2021 then, and the moment we find ourselves in is the climate movement. But it's, well, if everyone agrees, I feel like we've come to a kind of conclusion that the issue is capitalism. So in my head, anything that weakens capitalism and the capitalist state, I should support as a progressive. Anything that weakens imperialism. And so that's why I see no contradiction in investing a lot of energy into supporting the struggle against Israeli apartheid, for Palestine, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or against like immigration detention, police brutality. It's actually not irrelevant what the cause is, but they're all interlinked. And I think the role for people who see that, who have that understanding, is to try and draw those links out, because no movement can ever be big enough if it's isolated from other movements. Like, even if like the number of people in this country that supported Palestine doubled, if they didn't then make links with other movements that also need to demand justice, then it by themselves they can't win. So what I want to talk about now then is what I've kind of alluded to, this barrier that I found in the war movement, but to understand how the economic structure has led to the political situation that we find ourselves in. I found a good quote saying that social democracy, and by social democracy I kind of mean it's not socialism. Even if they, like Corbyn for example, he calls himself a socialist, but what he's promoting is actually social democracy. It's not getting rid of the capitalist state. There's never been any kind of suggestion of doing anything to actually get rid of capitalism. So, social democracy is the product of imperialism. Its social base is the privileged layers of the working class. These privileges arise from the sustained prosperity of the major capitalist nations, a prosperity dependent on the super exploitation of oppressed nations. And I think this is it's from an article in FRFI. It's probably Robert Clough. I think there's a really great article called Fighting Climate Change, Beware False Friends, which I'm going to refer to now. But I just wanted to clarify that, in a way, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about this particular movement. That's just where we find ourselves now when we're trying to get ready for COP. But in a year's time, 2 years' time, something else, housing might erupt. The same trends will be seen, and the same kind of strategies will also be necessary to try and resist them. Now, what's important to understand is how change comes about. If you look globally and historically, then often you get a spontaneous movement of an outpouring of anger, of rage. The content might differ, but you've seen it again and again, like so many different places, and we can't make that happen. So sometimes when we're out on the streets campaigning, people think we're trying to, like, I don't know, see if enough people sign the petition, then they can all join us, and then that's going to be the movement. That's not actually what we think. We think that oppression breeds resistance. People have historically resisted, and there's no reason to think that they won't again. So it's logical to kind of assume that they will. When that happens, though, it's often characterized by great outbursts of energy, but political formlessness. And this certainly has happened, like, in the last few years, with the kind of young people getting involved with the climate movement, and I would argue also with the Black Lives Matter movement from my experience here in Nottingham. And there's two outcomes. This is Robert Clough writing in the paper there's two outcomes of those movements. Either they can end up facing isolation and defeat if they don't develop a political clarity, or there could be an emergence of political consciousness which could represent an existential threat to the ruling class. And obviously that's what we want, because in order to dismantle capitalism, we have to take power away from the ruling class. Now, the ruling class is very aware of this too. You know, they've studied the same texts. They've looked at the Russian Revolution, what happened, the Paris Commune, the Black Power movement in the US, all the anti-colonial struggles. Don't think that they're not prepared. Of course they are. They're doing this same. They're maybe not in such, like, in a posher venue, possibly, but they're doing their research. They know why, and they know that repression can sometimes backfire. Even in the last few years, when we've seen in Paris, all the protests, and there was a lot of police brutality, and I always find it surprising, but it is true that the more brutality that there is, it actually can bring out more people rather than deter people. And so that is kind of risky from their point of view. Another option is to buy off the leadership of the movements, and we see that happen a lot. In this article, Robert's talking about Greta Thunberg, who's an interesting leader because she doesn't have she doesn't have any organizational ties, particularly, to people who are listening to what she has to say. And at this point, at least, Robert says, she's kind of been fairly incorruptible in terms of just her position. Now, I would argue that her analysis is limited because she doesn't go into capitalism, but I don't think that Greta Thunberg is the problem, and that hasn't been how they've tried to attack the movement. So if these two strategies don't work, then they need to use organizations with a materialist stake in the system, and that's where we come back to this more privileged section of the working class. And another term to refer to these people is opportunists. So you can have organized opportunists who are very deliberately working in order to kind of keep a lid on things, keep things respectable. And you will notice different tactics are quite similar, like making sure that there's always a pre-arranged list of speakers, making sure that a demonstration rounds up in plenty of time, or an alternative strategy, making sure you talk and talk and talk at people for so long that people get bored and drift off. I've also seen that be quite an effective strategy to just kind of... Oh, another one is the classic, let's stand in silence to remember the dead, instead of standing in anger with those who are still fighting back. There's all these kind of tactics that get used, and it's... At first I used to get really surprised to see exactly the same thing happen again. But yeah, no, it makes sense. In terms of the climate struggle then, who are the false friends? Now, Robert mentions the trade unions, and he gives a good example of what, how they've acted as a false friend. So the TUC, which is a trade union congress, they called a strike in support of the school students on the 20th of September 2019, and or was it 18?
2019 was the big wave of school strikes, I believe.
October 19, yeah. But then when it came down to it, by the end, I'm not going to go, you can read the article, but by the end what happened was to support a 30-minute workday campaign action to coincide with the global school strike in your lunch break. So they actually didn't challenge, no one went on strike. No, it was just like a tokenistic thing to show the young people that we care. And yet, consider that if you talk to, and I do recommend anyone that's kind of, if you're getting involved new to politics, make sure you talk to different groups and find out what they think the solution is, because you will hear a lot of that we have to work with the trade unions. And I don't know, I think even Marx in his day was clear that the trade unions had played a role in an economic defence. But if you're living in an imperialist country, that is quite dangerous, because, for example, in my political lifetime, I've seen trade unions stand against asylum seekers demanding better treatment in detention centres and enter detention, because it goes against the interests of their members, who are members of like the immigration border force. Equally with climate change, you've got trade unions that are demanding subsidies for the air industry. You've got trade unions that are trying to support the continuation of fossil fuel industries. And so we're not anti-trade unions. There's a role to play, but their role in an imperialist country where we benefit off the exploitation of the rest of the world, unless it's an anti-imperialist struggle, then the role of the trade unions can be reactionary. So that's the first false friend. The second one he mentions is Extinction Rebellion, and I'll quote, it says, "It may seem strange to identify Extinction Rebellion as a false friend, given that it is credited with being the initiator of the fight against climate change in Britain." Now, the criticism here of Extinction Rebellion is not about the form that action takes, but the fact that they are very strongly, they call themselves beyond politics. And I would say this is not true. I mean, first of all, to be beyond politics is problematic when politics is the cause of the problems. But also, there were people quite high up, very influential within Extinction Rebellion, who, for example, Claire Wordley launched an unfounded attack on the progressive Bolivian government of Evo Morales at a time that there was a coup against that government, and that government is one of the few that had declared, had signed the eco-socialist declaration that was mentioned. They'd kind of in their constitution given rights to Mother Earth, as they called it, Pachamama, and when you look in, I don't have time to go into Bolivia more in depth, but if anyone's interested, there's a really good, very short, just like a short documentary explaining the link between lithium Elon Musk, Bolivia, and the coup, because it's got strategic resources, and we just have to be very, very careful listening to the bourgeois press when they're talking about places like Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, because there's very strong influences at play, and we have to be aware that the media in this country, I think 90% of it is owned by 3 companies, and like I found out the other day, I don't know how I didn't know this, but that the Independent is actually owned by a Saudi businessman now, and that's apparently part of the rebranding as the Eye. The Guardian receives substantial funding from NatWest, despite the declaration on when you scroll through the app, it says we're independent journalists, but they all benefit from advertising, and I think that links to what we're doing, because it's so important to be able to have an analysis that is based on just the support of readers, because no one can corrupt us apart from us. Do you know what I mean? It's much more difficult. It's more honest. Also, the whole thing about XR's kind of almost like religious obsession with non-violence, I think would be worth kind of raising in the discussion as to what is violence. I know some of us had this discussion a bit in one of our recent FRFI groups, and I think it's quite a privileged position, because if you, we heard how many people, 750 million people suffering from malnutrition that is unnecessary. I consider that violence, and we've seen the pollution of waterways, the fact that people don't have enough water to drink, the accidents that happen in these mines and other things, the sweatshops, the Rana Plaza collapse a few years ago, all of these things, they are a systematic violence. And so to only be against violence when the violence is of those who've been oppressed by the system, it's at best naive, at worst hypocritical. Next, the Labour Party. I'm not sure I need to go into this one that much, but I think it should be clear from what we've discussed that any Green New Deal that doesn't consider Britain's relationship to the rest of the world is a sham. It doesn't matter if we've got, solar powered everything, if those materials for solar panels are being extracted in an exploitative manner, and that the decisions about resources are not being made democratically by the world's people. So it's I don't know. I don't think the Labour Party really is the biggest false friend, because people have lost credibility. But it is amazing how tenacious it is, that over the years it can do terrible things, like hundreds of thousands of people killed in the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and then yet still it can be presented as a progressive party. And a lot of energy has been wasted in the last few years into sustaining an electoral campaign for a very nice guy, but who's not going to change anything and refuses to take the positions that are necessary, like withdrawing from NATO, for example. Basic things like supporting freedom struggles like the Palestinians, and it refuses to do that. So we can have a debate about whether Labour is or isn't a false friend. I just wanted to mention one person that I don't know if any of you have heard of, and I'm not trying to attack her specifically, but it's more using her as an example of some of the kind of arguments we need to be cautious of.
Hooray.
Yeah, that's what she does. No, her name's Naomi Klein, and I mean, to be fair, I credit her with part of my politicization as a young adult, and I think that's partly why when we say false friends, then it's almost because the friend element makes these people more dangerous. And why I say dangerous is because I think we all know the message now.
No,
it'll fall down again, and then it'll be depressing.
It's not an OCG event unless something falls down.
What I'm trying to say about it being dangerous is, I would say at this point, with the information that we've heard about the urgency of reversing the trajectory that humanity is on, then any kind of arguments that encourage people to think that you can solve the climate emergency and the environmental emergency without destroying capitalism and like building socialism, fighting for socialism, are dangerous because they're diverting people from the path of what's actually necessary. And you cannot have you can't discuss socialism without discussing state power and how the struggle for state power. Now, Naomi Klein is a very engaging writer, and not only is she a writer, I mean, you can buy however many books you want on the climate, different climate questions at the moment, but it presents herself as an activist, and she speaks to large audiences, but she's ever so dismissive, for example, of the Soviet era socialism. She just dismisses it all as, I think, productivist. And in the Revolutionary Communist Group, it's not that we don't have criticisms of the Soviet Union, but I think every criticism needs to be placed in its context. So the Soviet Union, even at the minute of its birth as a revolutionary state, was threatened with invasion by, I think it was 16 imperialist armies. During the Second World War, then the Soviet Union lost more lives per capita than any other country in the world fighting fascism. And in terms of environmentalism, you have to understand that this was a country that had, they had people starving in the beginning, in the First World War. The people were starving, and they needed to very quickly try and feed the people. And they did this by industrializing agriculture, by building factories, which, to be fair on them, it wasn't really known at that time how harmful that could be. What we need to understand is that, socialism, all that means is under capitalism, you have the dictatorship of the minority, of the bourgeoisie. Under socialism, you have the dictatorship of the majority, or of the proletariat. And until you break down those class antagonisms, you can't have a communist society where everyone just gives what they can, takes what they need. And so the thing with socialism is it's very new. It's this new idea, and it's been practiced. It brought huge advances to the people, not only in the Soviet Union, but it allowed the struggles, gave support to struggles against imperialism, colonialism. It had a massive positive impact. And there's actually also, Candice, do you want to model your t-shirt a minute? There's actually there was a lot of kind of support for environmentalism within the Soviet Union, which is completely dismissed. For example, rights of way, whereas in this country, people, have had to fight for the right to be able to walk on private land and for the footpaths and stuff. Then in the Soviet Union, that was one of the first things they did to give people access to the countryside. But yeah, again, in school, all I was taught about the Soviet Union was the Aral Sea disaster, which was a disaster. They basically over exploited the land for cotton, and a lake dried up, and it caused a lot of environmental pollution. But it's just the hypocrisy of making attacks without placing them in their context, when the same attacks aren't leveraged against capitalist countries. It kind of disincentivizes people from researching further. And our interest is not to idealize the Soviet Union, but it's to learn from the Soviet Union, to learn from their mistakes as well as their achievements. And I think concretely how we do that, is we look at Cuba. Cuba followed a slightly different path, and some of the decisions they made allowed them. There's another very good book that we sell called Cuba, what is it called now? No, that one. We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Survived in a Post-Revolutionary World, or something like that. And So I just don't want to give the impression that I'm sitting here saying like, oh, well, no, if you're socialist, you have to defend everything that went on in the Soviet Union, and that's why Naomi Klein's bad. It's not that. It's that she just dismisses it. And so what we need to understand is how things can change. But what she never talks about Cuba. And that comes back to, you remember right at the start, I was saying that there's an absence. And if you've got a platform of millions of people that listen to you, then actually it's your duty to talk about the most environmentally sustainable country. And if you don't understand enough about it, she's been writing about this stuff for 20 years. She's had time. And so we just have to be aware that sometimes the arguments that seem to be on the side of the environment, like I've got her book, one of her books in my bag here, and it's got, I'm not saying don't read her, like it's got some really useful information in it. This is one she wrote a few years ago called This Changes Everything. But in terms of like Naomi Klein and others, like the Extinction Rebellion, who are essentially demanding reforms without giving people the understanding of what will be necessary to achieve those, it makes it even more difficult for us as well, because if people are able to kind of present it like there's just some sort of solution, that, oh, we just, we have some protests and then the ruling class will change their ways and become less greedy. But that's not how the world works. There has to be a revolutionary struggle will entail the ruling class resistance. Just as one example of that, in Argentina, when in 2001, there was a massive economic crisis, and basically the shareholders and the stock exchanges decided to withdraw all their money from Argentina as a vote of kind of no confidence, which totally just screwed the economy. So there were factories that were no longer producing anything. Now, the workers in those factories decided just to carry on running the factories because they knew how to do it. They were massively attacked by the police. And at that point, they had to make a choice whether to defend the factories against police invasion or whether to give up. But the question of violence is often presented as if like, or if you support a revolution, then you're somehow like an advocate of violence. And it's a really harmful argument, and we have to question why are people putting it forward? Because unless people are clear what the state is prepared to do, even during the coronavirus pandemic, it mentions in this argument, the army was put on hold, put on standby, not just to go around giving people tests, which they didn't do, but they were put on standby to quell any riots. Because at the start of 2020, in March 2020, the ruling class was not sure whether they were going to be able to feed everybody, like whether the supermarkets could cope. And so they put the army in place, ready to quash the population. And that's why understanding the power of the state is so important. Not to be defeatist, it's not like it's not possible, but if you don't know what you're up against, you're not going to win. And the approach that, for example, Extinction Rebellion has taken, and they're not the only ones, to say almost like glorifying arrest, is really privileged, because it is very different to get arrested if you are a middle-class white grandmother in your 70s or something, than if you are a young black person living in London, for example, or someone with insecure immigration status, or someone even who just needs to get to their job the next day because otherwise they'll lose their job if they don't turn up. Now, I'm also not saying, oh, well, we just have to build a movement where no one gets arrested. I'm saying we have to be realistic about the force that we're up against. We have to understand that the court system is part of the same system. The police are part of the same system that want to maintain power for the minority. And so in order to struggle against them for the world's majority and for the planet, it involves us being organized, committed, willing to defend each other if people do get arrested. So like in our organisation, for example, if we'd never plan to get arrested, but we always have a plan of what to do in case someone does get arrested. And that involves ensuring that they are never left in the police station by themselves with no support outside. And, you know, things like that are really important. But what you can hear from a lot of the kind of climate movement and some of the meetings I've been to is, it's like if you don't stay positive, you'll put people off. And what I'm arguing here today is, no, that is part of a dangerous argument, because unless people understand what we're up against, then we can't win. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I hope it hasn't come across as depressing, because I really think we can win, and people have got the power. And you like, historically, you know, think about all the things that people thought would never change, like the aristocracy, slavery, you know, colonialism, the fact women not being able to vote, or like just change is always possible. It's just about understanding how it can come about and being aware of whose side we're on. Also, just last thing then. So whose side are we on? I would say in this struggle, we're on the side of those who are taking action against imperialism. We heard about those 250 struggles in Latin America. I've read recently, there's all sorts of like movements happening around the world, like the farmers' strike, for example. But we need to get to a point where we're organised and big enough here that the minute something happens elsewhere, if there's a strike, we can do more than just have like a placard on our stall saying, you know, we support the Indian farmers. That we can shut down a production facility that is benefiting from, you know, whichever company it is that's involved in the kind of corruption. You know, so sometimes there's this view that I hear again and again on the streets of people we meet that, oh, but there's nothing we can do. But actually, living in the belly of the beast, like in the heartland of imperialism, then we've got more power here to shut down the system than our comrades have in other countries around the world. And you don't hear the Palestinians complaining about how futile it is. They just go out the next week and face the tear gas and the bullets again because it's necessary. And so I think by situating ourselves within that struggle, we don't have to take down the capitalist system by ourselves in Nottingham. All we have to do is support a global movement that already exists, that has been taking action. Well, it's a struggle that's been ongoing for hundreds of years, and it has ups and downs, and do what we can to kind of contribute from where we are. And there's just so much we can do. So hopefully we can talk a bit about concrete actions in the discussion.